As Hannah said, I'm Sarah Gong. I work at the council. So just some background, one of our earlier panelists from this morning, Garrett, the CEO of Africa Town in Seattle, had shared that communities need translators in government to listen to a community's needs, apply pressure on the inside, and translate those messages in ways that other government staff will be receptive to without whitewashing or losing the integrity of the message. So that's the lens that I will be coming from today. So that's more than enough about me. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to take about 5 minutes each to introduce themselves and the amazing work that they are doing. James, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is James Garrett Jr. I am the managing partner at Formula Architects here in St. Paul. We have also recently started a spin-off of Formula that is in the development space that is called Vanta Black Partners. And we are currently developing in conjunction with Seward Redesign, the US Bank space on Lake Street that burned down in the second night of civil unrest. And so we're moving back and forth between my role as an architect, sort of leading a visionary process, and then now embracing this new role as developer, where we look to hold space for community, both physically and also sort of spiritually, and get people involved and at the table and create processes that support them.
Thank you very much, James. Karla, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Karla Henderson, and I am the Community Development Director for the City of Bloomington. I have been here about 1.5 years. Relocated here from Detroit, Michigan last March. And so community development, this department entails a number of divisions. We have our planning, assessing, environmental health, building and inspections, our port authority, and our housing redevelopment authority. It's about 75 employees that I get to wake up and come to work. Very privileged to work with them each and every day. And I like to call community development the heartbeat of the city because we touch just about every aspect of our city government and our residents and our stakeholders and constituents. I also like to steal a phrase used by our city councilwoman, Lona D'Alessandro, who talks about, she likes the fact that we put community into development and really have been spending the last 18 months getting the team to work together in a more cohesive way, and then how do we actually put community as a priority as we move through our entitlements and our inspections, and it's just been wonderful. So I want to thank Sarah for moderating the panel. I haven't had an opportunity to meet James until this afternoon, but we are taking a formerly used fire station in East Bloomington and turning it into a small development resource center. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but actually Formula is our architect. So we're working with his team. So nice to see everybody. And thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. And it's just beautiful to hear that you two are already collaborating. So just really turning our theory into praxis, always amazing. And then last but certainly not least, see Terrence.
Yeah, good to be with everybody today. I'm Terrence Anderson. Some folks, Met Council folks probably know I might have early onset COVID right now. So just want to remind folks that we're still in a pandemic, mask up, take care of yourself, all those good things. But hopefully I can live up to being on this panel amongst these great folks who I have great respect for, James and Karla. Otherwise, yeah, I'm C. Terrence Anderson, Director of Community-Based Research at the Center for Urban Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And yeah, I get to do a lot of different things at the University of Minnesota at KIRA. Principally is community engaged research. And so I think there's a number of folks in this room that I've got a chance to partner with through the programs that we do. But ultimately, I think our work is centered around building the capacity of community to have power over issues that affect them. Yeah, living into what Sarah said, you know, which is, I think Kira gets a chance to sort of be a translator or sort of a communicator between community and government. And so I also get the chance to work with government folks quite a bit as well too. So yeah, we do a lot of different things, name the community engaged research, but we also are a granting organization. We're sort of an intermediary for the McKnight Foundation, which means that we sort of are entrusted with a portion of their funds to pass into community. We like to use art as a praxis of demystifying, deconstructing, reimagining public policy as well too. So kind of gets a chance to operate in a number of different spaces. I get to hang out with both James and Karla on occasion, and lots of other great folks. And so it's good to be here today.
Thank you so much, C. Terrence. And we've got comments in the chat saying, be well. I hope you are feeling well soon. Thank you for making the time to be here. And, you know, just from these introductions, it's so very clear that all of you have a breadth of knowledge in your respective sectors. You know, equitable development does not happen in a vacuum. And so I'm so pleased that we have just this beautiful spread of knowledge and perspectives that you'll share with us today. And so without further ado, why don't we get into our panel discussion? So this first question or topic is for the group. From your perspectives, can you describe the structures in place that prevent equitable outcomes? And then with the challenging structures you have described, what are ways you have thought creatively to work around such structures? And whoever wants to jump in first can just jump in.
All right, I guess I can jump in. For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this question of structures is a really, really important one because I think a lot of folks who work in government and a lot of folks who are pushing governments from the outside sort of recognize the limitation of structures all the time. And, you know, when we sort of think about inequitable outcomes, you know, today, I think what a lot of folks wise than me would say, if they ask the question, how did we get here? And the answer is we drove here, meaning that we sort of have had a prescriptive grouping of policies as well as programming and investments that sort of have produced the outcomes that we see today. Therefore, when we're thinking about you know, equitable development or producing equitable outcomes, it's not just about folks in government making better decisions, right? Of course, there's good folks. A lot of those folks are in the room today, for sure. But they're also hamstrung by the structures themselves too. So when we're thinking about shifting equitable outcomes, I think we're most principally talking about shifting towards equitable structures. And I think, you know, equitable structures is about being cognizant of a history of racial harm and other sort of structural harms towards groups of folks, and ratifying them to be ones in which sort of deliver the body of resources, agency, and power over issues that they really care about. So I think a lot about that from the perspective of KIRA, and sort of the way in which we sort of are about capacitating community, often these folks who've been disenfranchised from structures to have more power and consent and agency in areas that truly affect them. So I'll start off the conversation there.
Thank you, C. Terrence. I'll go next. I appreciate the question. You know, a couple of years ago when everybody was declaring racism a public health crisis, here, I'm speaking from the city of Bloomington, our city council decided that we were going to do something that we call more than a resolution, which means we're going to put some resources behind what it means to engage our community, listen to our community, and then come out with kind of answering what their call has been, what community has decided that they need, And so the Small Business Development Center was a product of that. That was community saying, we need a place that our local, like small business owners or budding entrepreneurs can go. That's not City Hall, a safe space where creatives can go and be engaged with city staff. It's not just come to, City Hall and get a form and, you're kind of on your own, because I find that access to information, particularly as a government, there's a cost to it. There's a cost in terms of time, and sometimes there's a cost in terms of like hiring a consultant that can guide you through the development process. And so what if we were to kind of eliminate those barriers? And so I can use an example of a small business owner here in Bloomington that is interested in expanding his sandwich shop. And so, he came in, he told us what he wanted to do. We took him across the street to Public Works and Utilities and actually sat there and looked at the map to see, where his new hydrant would have to go, what water lines would have to be upgraded. That information, he should be able to have it, and not have to stumble through our development process. So I think I'm real keen on, again, putting community into the development and actually being more responsive to what the community wants than anything else in my role here at the City of Bloomington. And I'll kick it off to James.
Yeah, and I think I'm actually going to share my screen briefly to maybe talk through my response. I think for me, a lot of times, equitable development doesn't happen because the structures and the muscle memory, let's say, of folks that actually engage in development is conditioned to do things one way, and it's not flexible enough. It's not pushed or challenged enough to do things another way. This is a project that I worked on as an architect, where I pushed and pushed and pushed and challenged the developer to incorporate various aspects of equitable development. And sometimes that meant finding ways to integrate the work of the people that are actually living there. This is Great River Landing. It's a 72-unit supportive housing project for men that have been homeless or at risk of homelessness due to prior incarceration. And they learn deconstruction and they deconstruct buildings. And so forcing the hand, designing things specifically into the building that the men themselves had created. So this wood, for instance, in the main lobby, came out of buildings that they literally deconstructed. And so purchasing, forcing the project to purchase from the men in the program to support the program, even though it cost a little bit more. I think it was like 25 cents per square foot more for some of these materials, but to support the men, to show them that what they're doing is important, that it can be beautiful and it's meaningful, and to integrate those types of things throughout the building. Sometimes that's what equitable development means. Sometimes it means integrating art into buildings where instead of numbering the floors, we literally used color and these beautiful art symbols that Roger Cummings from Juxtaposition Arts created for us. So the floors are no longer branded as they were in prison by numbers and letters, but it's by colors, it's by themes. This one is called acceptance. So the second floor is the acceptance floor, right? Sometimes it means creating spaces for men to interact with their children. So supervised visitation and trying to reconnect and bridge family gaps, as we learn that recidivism is best attacked by recreating, and strengthening those bonds between community and family. We literally were able to manipulate the building to create space for people to be able to play with their kids in a kids-oriented space. Again, integrating art, integrating meditation spaces. We learned that a number of the men had converted to Islam while they were incarcerated, and they needed a space to be able to pray. Some people need to meditate. They have instruction on how to de-escalate conflict. And some of the de-escalation technique and tactics is to take a break and to walk away from the conflict. And there was no retreat space. So these meditation spaces that we were able to integrate into each floor allow people to retreat, to think, to take a deep breath, and to de-escalate. Sometimes it's about materials and about using better quality materials than the ones that are sort of commonly thrown out there, and fighting to say that, you know what, doing something sustainable doesn't cost more, it just costs differently. There's a different series of decisions that need to be made in order to have a superior functioning building. The same thing with HVAC systems. There's these assumptions that every single building is going to have, you know, on the left here, what's called a magic pack or direct vent system, but it's extremely inefficient. It basically cuts Swiss cheese holes out of the facade of the building and allows, you know, cold air to pass through in the wintertime and hot air to creep in the summertime, and it's extremely inefficient. And so pushing them and challenging them to use a more proper system that's going to function better. Also insisting on warmer materials that feel humane versus materials that don't. But these are so much easier to clean, right? But these feel so much better for human beings, and we're trying to create an environment for human beings. So sometimes equitable development is advocating for things that are more humane as opposed to things that are easier to clean, right? Sometimes it's having fixed windows versus being able to advocate for windows that are actually operable so that people can actually open their window and get a fresh breeze, which is something that, you know, was completely foreign on this project, but it's something that we really pushed for. Why can't people have the control over their environment to be able to open a window and get some fresh air? Advocating for bathtubs instead of only showers. When you have men that have been incarcerated for 5, 10, 20 years, and they're coming out and they've been forced to shower standing up for their, you know, entire adult lives sometimes, being able to have the option to be able to have a bathtub with a shower so people can do either, whatever they feel like, but have that individual choice. And that was something that they tried to take out of the project at the last minute for no real reason, but we had to fight for and advocate for. This is the humane thing to do, right? Sometimes equitable development is about advocating for renewable energy. And these types of buildings have never had solar panels and technology integrated into them. Well, this one will. So again, integrating art, integrating technology, integrating humanity, creating spaces for children and families in places that are usually not considered that. Those are all equitable development issues and things that we need to be able to advocate for and do a much better job sort of, you know, supporting.
Thank you very much for sharing, everybody, and James, thank you so much for sharing the slides with a powerful example. I think what I'm hearing from all of you is that you're very conscious about space when it comes to equitable development. So, you know, from Karla, what I heard is, you know, going to people's space and sharing the knowledge instead of expecting them to come to you, which also kind of shifts the power dynamic as well. And then from Terrence, being that literal space between communities and governments and being that bridge. And then from James, you know, creating space and reclaiming space in not just a physical and tangible way, but also a very spiritual healing way. It's all very beautiful. Thank you for sharing. So for our next question, what are misconceptions about equitable development in your respective fields?
I can jump in quickly. I'll start this one off and then pass it along. For me, I think, as I mentioned, one of the misconceptions is that it costs more. And there's always this cost imperative in every project that we do, especially projects that serve disenfranchised folks in communities. There's always this consciousness about money. We don't have money. We don't have money. It's a real deficit mind state. And we try to challenge that and break that. And again, it doesn't necessarily cost more, but it does cost differently. There's a different decision chain that you start to go down when you start thinking about equity and integrating equity into every aspect of a project. And so you have the same budget, but instead of doing A, you're doing B, right? And so you're making those conscious choices throughout the process, and it ends up penciling out about the same. You know, you can make terrible decisions and continue to do mediocre spaces, you know, that I feel like do a lot of damage to folks. Or you can constantly challenge. Every time you come to that fork in the road and a decision needs to be made, you can start to, you know, make the equitable decisions and the equitable choices. And what we found as you go down that tree, you get to the same place from a budgetary standpoint. So it is a complete misnomer that's adding art and color into a project. I mean, you have to have paint. Does it cost more to have a beautiful, bright yellow paint that an artist picked out than eggshell? No, it absolutely doesn't. It costs the same, but it's a conscious decision and choice that then have a whole myriad of positive results on the backside.
I love that James provided that answer, because when I think about some of the misconceptions, so when he talked about money, I think about time, that in government, particularly when you're talking about staff time, you know, we have a racial equity impact assessment tool that we developed, and it, you know, we had staff at all levels coming up with this this assessment. And, you know, we kind of piloted out to the department, and right away people said, oh, how much time is that going to add for me to have to go and ask certain questions about this development? So anytime we have a big project or a code amendment or a comp plan amendment or a district plan amendment, we're telling staff, you have to go through and answer these questions about the impact it's going to have. So from that lens of racial equity, and right, you know, immediately some staff were like, it's just going to take too much time. How much time is that going to add to that item that I have to take to the planning commission or the city council? And so fighting against that perception that this is not an added thing. This is embedded into the work that we do. This is just as you draft up the memo to city council, now you're going to put this assessment tool with it. This is just part of the package, because we wanted to dispel that false narrative that, you know, this was just another thing I had to do to check off, and then really write that paragraph to city council so that city council had a clear understanding that whatever that change that we were doing to the code, what the impact was, it was going to have on our community, and then what were some of the things we were going to do to mitigate the impact in instances where we knew that there may be a negative impact, or should we even move forward with that code amendment at all? And it's really helped push staff to think of things in a different way, because it forces interaction with other people, and also it offers different perspectives.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm probably going to take it just a little bit of a different direction, because I think, you know, when we're talking about misconceptions to equitable development, I think we first have to be sure that we're talking about the same thing. I think in my experience, what folks mean by equitable development is pretty across the board. Like, it's almost like trying to describe the color blue, sometimes the analogy that I use. We realize over time, like, I might be talking about the color dark blue, or some folks are talking about the color light blue. Some people are talking about the color green and calling it blue, and like stuff like that, right? And we can sort of kind of, I don't know, joke about that, but I think, you know, a lot of governments reach out to CURA, you know, to say, hey, help us make this project more equitable. And my first question is, okay, well, what's the historical inequity that we're attempting to address? And often the response is sort of just, oh, no inequity in particular, just look at these disparities in our region. We're just trying to respond to that. And my response often is that doesn't make any sense to me. Right? Equitable development is a response to specific harms, and the more specific we can sort of be about them, the more specific we can understand what we're trying to accomplish. But let's just say that we're in a room and we're sort of, responding to a history of redlining and racial covenants and disinvestments into Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, right? That's led to a loss of wealth and home ownership and all these different sort of things. And then, but then yet sort of a lot of governments speak about equitable development in the context of, say, Section 8 housing. And it's not to say that Section 8 housing isn't good or that it's bad, but I don't think it's an equal response to that history of harm that's happened within redlining, disinvestment in communities, and overall loss of wealth, right? We really need to be responding in equal to this history of inequity in history. And I don't know if most folks sort of aspire in that same way. And so I think, what I'm always, inspired by James is like what James was talking about is he respond in his previous answer was responding to these distinct histories of harm, these distinct practices of harm. They're not abstract, right? He's sort of speaking specifically about what humanization means within the context. But I don't think that's the way that it is most of the time, especially when we're operating at the policy level around projects, right? And so I think it's, for the first part, the misconception is this belief that we can abstractly address a history of harm and expect that we're going to get different results. And I just think, frankly, that's just not going to be the case, right? And I think that community is always trying to stretch the Overton window about what's acceptable within governments. For example, in the Twin Cities, communities are trying to stretch MnDOT and other organizations to reconsider the way that I-94 exists as a facility within our region, right? And they're saying things like build a land bridge. Another group is saying, hey, tear the whole road out and let's put in something that's much more at the human scale, right? And that's totally blowing the minds of organizations here. And I'm sure around the country, the idea to take out an interstate between two major cities, which aren't that far away from each other, but taking out a major interstate is just unfathomable. But the truth is that I-94 has contributed to substantial and continues to create substantial harm in communities. And then yet we're sort of saying, like, how can we make this project equitable, right? And so we first have to just sort of get out of the oxymoron that we're often trapped into, the logics that we're trapped in about equitable, which really just means like investing in proximity to Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, whether or not it benefits them or not, whether they have asked for it or not, whether they have control over it or not, right? Whether it's sort of humanizing them or not. But if it's just in proximity and we sort of have the intentionality of it, then that's good enough, right? So I think if there's any like the harshest message that I sort of send around this is that we have so much more to go in terms of our considerations of responding to history, in terms of humanizing folks, and in terms of fully repairing these histories of harm. I could probably dig into that for like another 3 hours. In fact, I was supposed to be at the Met Council right now doing that exact same thing. Worked out that I have COVID or whatever right now and to be able to talk about it here, but that's a big piece of it for me.
Yeah, can I just piggyback on what you said, Terrence, and also what Karla said? I think one of the really important components of this is time and timing. There is this notion that development has to happen immediately, that there's this speed that everything has to transpire at. And when we're dealing with for-profit development, yes, we are dealing with speed. We're dealing with loans that have to be paid back and complex financing mechanisms and a ton of things. But what we're doing intentionally at the U.S. Bank site, and one of the reasons why I believe we won that competition to redevelop that site was because we said we were going to pause. We were going to completely pause for a minimum of 6 months and thoroughly engage with community and listen to community and let the site percolate and marinate. And we were going to just re-envision, reimagine what it could be with people. We said that we weren't going to just bring preconceived ideas and sort of plop them onto this space. But the pressure has been enormous. It's been immense on us. I receive calls constantly from acoustical ceiling providers, masonry providers, people assuming that we have this plan that is going to happen immediately at light speed, and that if they don't hurry up and start sort of attacking me with emails and phone calls, that they're going to miss their opportunity to make some money off of this project. And we intentionally said that we don't know what this is going to look like. We didn't provide a bunch of renderings like the other teams of like this thing, because it's like, there is no thing because there is no conversation yet. We have not formulated the proper questions to ask, to then listen and engage with, to then marinate on and stew on and think about, and then considerately try to integrate into the work that we do, right? We haven't even formulated the proper questions yet. So no, there is no design. No, there is no plan. No, there is no, what there is are partners. We are going to engage with the Chicano Latino community, which we have. We're going to engage the Native American community, which we have. We're going to engage with the African American community, which we have. And we're going to create something that holds space for all these communities and allows opportunities for cross-cultural collaboration, holds physical space for mourning, holds physical space for protest, holds physical space for celebration, right? Contemplation, all these things. So we have this very strong conceptual vision, but the time aspect is the thing that we never have enough of, or we're constantly being pushed to do this, do that. What's this going to be? What's it going to look like? How tall is it going to be? We can't get financing unless we know. Slow down. This space needs to heal. This is a traumatic event that took place that even created this opportunity. And so we just had the land was officially turned over to our to the group, and we quietly last Friday had a ceremony in which tribal elders, we burned tobacco, we held hands, and we all talked about our wishes and our dreams for this space. We talked openly in this circle, candidly, about our hopes, dreams, and aspirations for healing in the community. And we burned tobacco on it, and we basically created a permission ceremony where we wanted to ask the ancestors for permission to be productive, to be creative, and to heal in this space. So those are things that can only happen intentionally, and they can only happen when you take the time to sort of let things sort of evolve and become, and you resist this tendency to just hurry up and do. And so time is also one of those, I think, misconceptions, that we don't ever have time and we don't ever have space. Well, we make space and we make time for the things that are valuable to us, and then we proceed.
Thank you very much for sharing that, James. What you were saying about making time, and being really intentional, it reminds me a lot of what Karla was saying about how it's not just an afterthought, it's not just a box that you have to check to get the equity requirement. It's something that really has to be, as you said, James, very intentional. And as Terrence said, getting to the actual root of the problem, and not just being a Band-Aid solution, but actually being reparative. And something that I'm hearing from all of you is that, under capitalism and white supremacy, everything has to be in order and everything has to go really fast. But what it sounds like a way that, and you're all doing this differently given your respective fields, but it sounds like something that all three of you are doing are really just creating your own space and creating your own time as a way to work around or combat those misconceptions.
I think it's really important. I think that part that you picked up, Sarah, about what Karla was saying, which is that it can't be an afterthought, really. I mean, I think we sort of like say this idea of like equity has got to be primary, but I don't think it's really under theorized about what that actually means for it not to be secondary, right? And I think it's, you know, I tried to sort of explain things at like the most human level possible, but it'd be like if, you know, I harmed Karla one-to-one as a person, and then we tried to continue a relationship, but not addressing what I did to harm her first, well, and containing that relationship would be ridiculous, right? In fact, it's probably almost impossible for us to continue a relationship, especially if it's been a significant harming, right? And so like, if we just have to think about it in that context of like when James says traumatic experience, right? It's sort of like, you know, we can under theorize, of course, like the nature of that trauma, and then just sort of say, you know, continue our engagement practices that don't really center folks' agency and humanity and dignity, not because it sounds like the nice thing to do, but because it's absolutely necessary as a response to that trauma. So I think, you know, there's a lot of ways in which we can sort of practice that out of a theoretical level, right? For me, it was when I worked in transit, and there was a person who distinctly asked the question, where do people who make under $40,000 or less, and where are the jobs that pay $40,000 or less, is our transit system connecting those two places in a way that allows those folks to get there, knowing that there's a huge barrier for them owning a car, or right, and that they may have a really long 2-hour transit commutes, right? And they addressed that and distinctly started planning at least a piece of the system around that, right? And there's probably a number of different examples in which you ask, okay, what's the problem first? Versus sort of like, hey, this is what we do at any point, anytime, right? This is just our normal cadence of doing our projects. How do we make that equitable, right? So it's sort of reframing like, what is the problem to be addressed, right? And what is constructive of that problem? I just think that under theorization, or the sort of that sort of casual secondary aspect of pursuing these things really complicates and damages that work from the beginning. And, you know, of course, there's been a lot of theorists who, you know, John Powell, who talks about targeted universalism, right? That's sort of a strategy and sort of a thought process that reorients the what that we're doing, and, you know, sort of defeating the mindset like, well, if we only focus on equity, then we wouldn't be building a whole system. But it's actually rebuilding the system through the lens of equity that's creating a humanizing system in the first place. So yeah, I think that's a big point.
See, Terrence, I love that you said that, because it just comes down to intentionality. And it takes me back. We had a consultant firm that we were going to do some developer roundtables here in Bloomington about 6 months ago. And they were, you know, naming off the developers that they were going to, you know, have at the table. And we said, well, we're the developers of color. Like, and if I feel like if you don't ask, then you just receive what they give you. But I made it very clear, you know, that, you know, we were not going to have this engagement with this consulting firm unless they were able to bring developers of color. And when we met with the developers of color to talk about the project, they mentioned this is the first time this firm has ever reached out to us. So, you know, I find my role is like being very intentional, not just accepting what, you know, a consulting firm is going to give me, but saying like, these other organizations need to be at the table as well. And where are they? Or we're not going to move forward. To James's point about time, like, I'm in no rush. Go out and find some qualified developers of color that can come and have a seat at this table as well. So I think that's important.
Thank you all for sharing. I'm just sitting here and taking in everything that you're sharing. So I think we can move on to our next panel discussion topic. So what does accountability in equitable development look like from your perspectives? And could you give us an example or some examples of ways that you have demonstrated accountability in your respective projects?
Yeah, I love this question. I think my favorite question I've been asked by anybody in probably the past 10 years of my life has been, how do you like to be held accountable? And I really had to think about that. And I still think about that question all the time. That's a really important point. In the context of, here's the distinct way that probably a lot of folks think about it is that, of course, engagement is part of that practice. But this is where we really have to think about the limits of structures, right? If governments or powerful institutions are the ones who get to say, this is when we're going to do this project, if they get to make the decision about the timing of that project, if they get to make a decision about what are the important questions, and they get to ultimately make the decision about what's going to happen, then really engagement doesn't play a large role, or the community doesn't really have a significant.
So I don't know if it's just me, C. Terrence, but I cannot hear you.
I can't either.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what's happened with that. Did you catch any of that or none of it?
I caught the after you said why it was an important question in the framing of being held accountable with engagement, and then engagement is one way, and then it cut off.
Oh, okay. So I think what I was saying was just that most engagement structures don't really allow for accountability. And I think what I was saying was, if powerful institutions, that could be governments, developers, whomever it might be, get to decide when to do the project, sort of what are the confines of what the project is delivering. They get to set the timing of the project and when it will talk to people. And then really, even whether people agree or disagree, they get to make a decision about what they might incorporate from what they hear from people. Then they ultimately get to make the final decision. Then that structure doesn't really allow for accountability from community, right? And so, another way to think about this, like governments have, equitable advisory committees that are subservient to another, broader policy making group, right? Doesn't really allow for accountability within that structure, right? It may be in its best hope and best delivery, folks who really want to hear what folks have to say, and out of the goodness of their hearts will maybe make a different decision, but that's not what the structure dictates by its very nature. So I think, first, accountability looks like organized communities, right? Really, the only thing that can battle structures are other powerful structures. And so I always think about, in the Twin Cities, I think we have an amazing organizing community that's prepared for a lot, right? That's prepared to show up in council chambers, that's ready to show up in front of developments, right? And I think that's a very critical element of accountability in our community. And so I think about, sometimes folks will come talk to Kira and say, what should engagement look like on this project? And I think we almost always respond resourcing, organizing, and community. But I think it's also that, you can't just engage around projects and that's the only time in which you can talk about something, right? Let's just sort of imagine 0 to 100, like this sort of spectrum, 0 to 100. If you're a 0, that means you know nothing there is to know about a subject. And if you're 100, you know everything that there is to know about a subject. Let's say you've been you've got your education in this, you've been doing this for your career for some amount of time. So you've got a pretty good understanding about what the way to do this work. And then, so say you're like a 60 or a 70 on the spectrum of 0. There's no hundreds and there's no zeros, right? Let's just say you're a 60 or 70 there is to know about that particular subject. Say there's a group of folks who don't have that, but maybe have their experiences, but don't really understand like all the ins and outs of it, and say they're a 20 to 30 on that spectrum, right? And let's say it's a very complicated project in which you take sort of years to come to your understanding. And then you try to digest all those things down and distill all those things down into plain language, and oftentimes speaking to like in an elementary sort of language is sort of like the goal a lot of the time. And you take a lot of the details out because you can't really prepare and present all those things in a 2-hour meeting. But then we say, in this 2-hour meeting, we're going to present this sort of distilled down group of information. And if you can give us a good comment within these next 2 hours, then maybe we'll change what we're doing, right? That's not even in that construction in which you have a much higher level of knowledge and power over a situation.
it's not even possible for that other group of people to consent to what you're doing in that pod. Like, even if they like spent that whole 2 hours asking you every single question, right? The structure of consent doesn't exist there, right? And I really want to center this word consent in there because, right, there's a lot of theorization about consent, right? It's not just saying yes or no to something. It's about the power that if you say yes or no, that it will be respected by the party who's receiving your consent, right? And so if you think about it in that construct, most powerful institutions don't have structures of consent to the people that they impact, right? They have structures of engagement. They have structures of sort of public information. Most of those fall short of a structure of consent, right? So I think, organized communities can be a challenge to that, right, in some sort of way, but they need to be resourced beyond projects in order to continually engage and build the capacity of folks in order to consent to a real situation. And the structures by which powerful institutions use to engage people need to think about and restructure within the confines and context of consent to really allow accountability to flourish and exist as an actual practice.
I think from my perspective, accountability is difficult for me because it's usually, in my experience, attached to a minimum amount of effort that needs to be put forth. And if you don't put this forth, then we're coming for you. Being so far ahead and beyond where community is, where the institutions are, where conventional wisdom is, that there's nothing that can hold me accountable. Like, I'm literally doing things that people cannot imagine could be done. And so it's like, I don't deal with minimums. I deal with maximizing what's possible with the time, the talent, and the resources available at any given time. And I hold myself to account at a higher level for challenging, the status quo and pushing things forward. I hold myself accountable at a higher level than anyone could ever hold me accountable. So accountability to me, in my experience as an architect and as a visionary and as a developer now, it's not really something that I deal with. To me, the accountability is a bar. And if I'm not clearing the bar to the point where the bar isn't even, in the frame, then I feel like I'm not doing enough, or I'm not doing my job properly. So I think for me, it's a challenge for me. I think accountability is meant for minimums, and I'm about maximums.
Thank you for sharing that, James. What you're saying really reminds me of the keynote speaker we had this morning, Neeraj. And Neeraj had talked about how, is it possible that we're just setting our sights too low? And so the framing that you bring, James, of, I wrote it down, the maximizing what's possible, I think, instead of having, as you earlier described, that deficit mindset, looking at what's possible. I think that is really beautiful and important for being a visionary. Karla, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think Terrence and James, yes, that answer blew me away. And I'm like doing self-reflection right now on, when I think about accountability, I think, in my role here, how I try to hold the staff accountable, but really wanting to be accountable to the community in which I serve is very important to me, to the constituents here. And really listening, when we talk about, I know Terrence talked a lot about the role that Kira plays between the community and government, but as a government employee, really focused on making sure that I am being accountable to my constituents and our community, and particularly the community here that has traditionally has been voiceless here in Bloomington, in this south suburb. We talk about a lot of the people that come that talk about, I've been here a resident for 30, 40 years. What are they trying to say? That the people that just moved here should not have a voice, and be able to express how they feel about things that are occurring in their own community, is something that is really evident like I said, in the year and a half I've been here. But yeah, just making sure that I'm holding myself accountable as well.
Thank you, Karla, and thank you, C. Terrence and James. So I think we can move into some individual questions now. James, if you don't mind, we can start with you. So for James, what avenues do you see to build capacity for developers of color? What kind of challenges come with that, and what successes have you seen in building capacity for developers of color?
I've been an aspiring developer for more than 20 years and have been engaged with some semi-famous battles with the city of St. Paul. We had a 12-year legal battle that ended relatively recently over a project that we tried to do a long time ago. So for me, I haven't seen a whole lot of support for developers of color until very recently. And so for me, I'm probably not the best one to answer that question. I'm a little bit cynical, I think, from my experiences, but I have seen more recently that there are, I think ULI, I participated in some workshops ULI has been doing for developer cohorts, diverse cohorts of developers. And so I've seen some things over the last few years that are encouraging, but really the resources are always the thing that shoot developers of color in the foot. Most of us don't have trust funds. We don't have families that bequeath large amounts, tracts of land and properties and things like that to us. We're often seen by lending institutions as higher risk than other groups of people, and so it's very difficult to attain the resources and the capital that is necessary to be a part of the development process. And so I'm a bit cynical in sort of what I've seen over the course of my career.
Well, that sounds really valid and understandable to me, James. And I really appreciate your honesty and vulnerability in answering that question. And, I am sure that current aspiring developers of color look up to you for inspiration. And I think a question that we've got heard from the audience is, James, I heard you use the word force in terms of forcing the developer to make improvements. I love that you're using that language and wonder if you can talk more about your role in the project and how you can force things.
Yeah, I think force of will and standing up and being willing to make tough decisions, being willing to push back when really inequitable things are taking place, or when people are trying to change the project in ways that are negative or potentially damaging to the people that are going to be living there. And I think really it starts with the entire approach. And so the way that we sort of approach projects is that we're not beholden to the check writer, right? We're not a tool to be sort of directed or appointed in a certain direction by the check writer. We're so much more than that. And rather than centering the check writer, who is obviously very important and is our client, we are much more interested with engaging with the people that are actually going to be living there, working there, going to school there. We're interested in trying to maximize what we're doing for the benefit of the users and not for the individual that might write the check but doesn't live 30 miles within a 30-mile radius of the project that's being built, isn't going to work there, isn't ever going to live there, doesn't know anybody that's even in the tax bracket that's ever going to live there. We like to sort of, I think we sort of try to sort of de-emphasize certain input, and we try to emphasize other input that maybe isn't traditionally listened to or appreciated or respected. And so we try to bring some type of a balance. And one of the things that I think has been disastrous is that for too long, the development process has been serving those with the money and not serving those that are actually going to be working there, living there, going to school there every day. And so trying to just invert that relationship and say, you know what, you're hiring us to do the best possible thing that we can do. So you're going to need to allow us some space to figure out what that is. And it's not necessarily going to be yes to everything that you say, because some of the things that you say or that you do are coming from a place that's outside of maximizing the benefit of this project to the individual users and the community. And so we try to weigh those things and balance those things and stand up to those things for the best interest of the project. And generally, when you do that, it is you're able to create something that is qualitatively superior to the prior things that were created without sort of that perspective or that point of view or that area of emphasis. And so we are interested in qualitatively superior projects and things that are going to serve well for a long period of time with the lowest possible impact on the environment. And so, we get owners and clients that align with those values. They have a tendency to let us really explore and to ask the questions that we need to ask and engage community as we need to engage community in order to get those outcomes. Sometimes, though, we do get clients or developers who are just interested in replicating what they did before the last time. And usually what they've done before has been mediocre at best. And we have a built environment that is completely full of examples of abject mediocrity, and we refuse to add to that. So sometimes it comes with some sharp words or some disagreements or whatever, but we've never been afraid to have those difficult conversations with clients, with community. Sometimes you got to tell community that you're out to lunch and what you're talking about is completely absurd, because sometimes it is, right? But you have to be willing to say we're invested in the best possible outcome for everyone. And that means that there's certain decisions that are going to be made, and not everybody is going to agree with those decisions or be happy with those decisions. But if you're doing it in the best interest of the project, the best interest of the long-term sustainability of a built space, and in the best interest of folks that are going to be using it on a daily basis, then you just kind of have to ask forgiveness later.
Thank you for sharing that, James. And Terrence, I see that you came off mute. Would you like to share something?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think everything that James said, first of all, but I also just want to go back to those structures that can be a part of these processes, which, I think maybe there's a later question about me talking about the Blue Line Extension anti-displacement work that I'm doing. But I think there's a number of tools that cities can employ to ensure that a higher level project that delivers towards the community's needs happens, right? So I think, of course, CBAs and as well as community MOUs, right? We can use, land use tools, I think we can use a range of policies that that are already within the tool bag of communities. It's just about who is the center of those policies that needs to shift, right? So I think in some sense, like we spend a lot of our time in policies focused towards major big developments, say 100 units plus, when we're talking about housing. Most developers of color aren't operating at that 100 units or plus area, right? They're more small mom and pops. Maybe they're talking about quadplexes, duplexes, single family housing a lot of the time, right? And I think those perhaps are more accessible, not perhaps, probably are more accessible to developers of color. And they serve a much, I guess maybe depending on the city that you're in, but in Minneapolis, that's the much wider category of housing in comparison to the large projects. So I think, in one part, right, if we're overly focused in some of our cities on these larger developments, which I think there's a lot more market forces supporting those projects in terms of getting there, right? A lot of our structure is meant to deliver those projects, but comparably, we spend much less time on our single family homing, duplexes, quadplexes, and those sort of things. And so I think think at a smaller level is actually a bigger level of thinking when you're thinking about the numbers, at least in the context of the Twin Cities. The other thing I think is a good example of that is rethinking who we even mean by developers all the time. In Minneapolis, right, there's this focus on Tenant Opportunity for Purchase Act. There's a lot of large focus and growing movement for the push towards co-op housing in the Twin Cities, which I know neither of these are old ideas, but it is a different type of developer when we think about it in that context, right? Sometimes it's the tenants themselves taking on an ownership role and redevelopment. If you're thinking of like, say, Inquilinos Unidos, here in the Twin Cities, right, their project Cielo San Frontieres, right, is this multi-unit building that was redeveloped and is owned by the tenants who live there, right? Why is that not considered development developers, maybe perhaps in the same sense as a new construction building, right? So I think adaptive reuse is another space, of course, and which we talk about. I think James, you've worked on a number of adaptive reuse projects over your time too, right? So what's the policy center is really the question that I'm talking about. Like, we have old tools, but who they're focused on, I think perhaps needs to change in this context. And so that's what I'm thinking of.
Thank you both, James and C. Terrence, for sharing that.
Hey, Sarah, I
yes.
just wanted to piggyback on something that
go ahead, please.
C. Terrence said, because you're absolutely right. When you think about the institutions that have created, these inequities, for me, it's more like the institutions now should be conscious of the things that need to happen. Right now, we're looking at our single family and two family housing ordinance, and with that racial equity lens, like what is preventing some of those developers that you spoke about? And so we're looking at code amendments like, reducing parking requirements or the lot size, and getting those kind of baked in and institutionalized and changed so that we, being a built out city, those lots are going to come up upon us, and really wanting to allow some flexibility so that developers of color can come in. And, we look at like the missing middle. We just had a study session with City Council about that. But all of that really is flowing out of our racial equity action teams for our department that is really pushing our planning team to look at the code amendments with that equity lens. And I love that it's encouraging our staff to look at it, and our council is very engaged, our planning commission is very engaged and very welcoming. So wanting to institutionalize those changes, I think, is important as well.
Thank you, Karla, and thank you for jumping in here, because that is a perfect segue. Well, a segue into a question for you, Karla. So, Karla, we've talked a lot about how, you know, as government staff or government employees, we are not neutral actors. So, how have you cemented yourself as a non-neutral advocate in this work?
Oh,
What
gosh.
challenges? I get it. Yeah. Oh gosh, that's true. What kind of challenges come with that, and what successes have you seen?
So I think it's really important that you know, we say representation matters, but definitely in what I would consider, I know you talked, the question said our planning team that drives and guides a lot of the work of how our city is going to be built. It's important to have representation on staff. I mean, we're an organization that is having a lot of retirements, and you know, looking at how the staff that we bring in now, really I'm looking like for the next generation of community development practitioners is important. But that whole I'll give you an example. We had a East African nonprofit that was going to do a tutoring program here in Bloomington. And the gentleman, the director, was saying, you know, I'm expecting about 75 kids, and our planning staff thought, oh my God, you know, some members, I should say, on the staff, you know, we're going to have you're going to need a traffic plan, because 75 kids must mean, you know, at least 70 cars. And, you know, when you talk to the folks that were participating, you know, they said, well, you know, some of us are going to walk, some of us are actually going to take transit, some of us, you know, we have 7 kids in our family, or 7 kids in the household. So I think that you know, people's lived experience, they come with that lens. And you know, so I was like, we're not going to have this nonprofit do a traffic study on, you know, how they're going to have the vehicles circulate, because we may be only talking about 10 cars. So trying to like encourage the staff to take off that lens. And how do we get to yes? Another example is we had a group that came to us that had purchased a building and had 5 uses that they wanted to have conducted in this building, and staff were telling them, you know, no, you can't do that, you can't do this. And also that lived experience, like they wanted to have an area where children could play, and they kept referencing the McDonald's playscape. And you know, the developers, the people that were developing the project, and the property owners were like, our family doesn't eat at McDonald's, we don't even know what you're talking about. And so really sitting down with staff on how do we get to yes, we ended up creating, I'm very proud of the staff, creating a brand new use for that district, so that those 5 uses could happen in that space. But it's really, I find, encouraging staff to get creative, particularly planners, because I think, you know, sometimes they have that black and white lens, and they don't see gray, and it's okay to see gray, and it's okay for us to kind of push the code, or ask for a variance or amend the code where we see fit, because we're not the same community we were back in 1970, when less than 1% identified as non-white. We're a community that's browning and growing, and so we need to be able to have staff that reflect that, as well as have codes and policies that reflect that as well. It's an everyday occurrence here in Bloomington, for sure.
Thank you, Karla. You know, what you said really, really resonates with me, especially, you know, your points about, you know, you're not the same community that you were decades ago. I think something that we often hear is in government is, no, you can't do that because this is the way we've always done things. But what if the way we're doing things isn't working for most of the people? What if it's only working for a select few who already have lots of money? You know, thank you very much for sharing that. I think with that we can move into some. Oh wait, one more. So we have one more question for C. Terrence. See, Terrence, you've done some amazing work around anti-displacement with the implementation of the Blue Line. Can you describe your role being that liaison between community and government?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm a super big fan of that body of work. I probably don't know. I don't know if I would use the word liaison. I don't know. Maybe some. I don't know what the perfect word is. I'm not gonna problematize that word at all. But I think in that effort really is again organized community being a big aspect of accountability. Right, the Blue Line Coalition and others were organizing the Hennepin County and the Met Council for a number of years to consider anti-displacement as an actual piece of the project, right, and to take responsibility over that. So, and that organizing was successful, and that's the whole reason why Kira's in the position that it is on that project at all. So I think I just wanted to tie back into that earlier conversation, right? One, an organized group of people realizing what their needs were, but also a responsive government of folks figuring out a way and a structure to deliver that. Ultimately, I think our work on the project is, I don't know, maybe we're kind of like a meta organizer, I don't know, second tier organizer of it, because I think the challenge with anti-displacement isn't to find the ideas, right? The ideas have existed, they've been practiced dispersely around the country, and even within our own region. I think the challenge is figuring out what matches the legal context, the distinct aspects of a light rail construction that neatly fits into the 5 different cities and communities that the line runs around, right? It's really about harmonizing those voices and actions to the resources and legal context that this project exists in. So Kira is playing the role basically of with University of Minnesota, our core production is knowledge, right? And so we're producing knowledge for the purpose of community, government, and philanthropy to get on the same page about what the problem is, what we can do about the problem, have the same language about the problem, the same policies and power to address those problems. And so, right, we're building consensus in another way, right? So, a liaison for consensus is probably what we're doing there, mainly through our production of knowledge, and in particular, resourcing community to be able to demand what they want. And I think we're getting a very transparent look into these different governments. We're offering transparency and accountability within this project to say, like, hey, here's our limits, right? If you want to do this, this is what we would need in order to do that. Or if you want this is why it wouldn't happen, because there's a state preemption law that would need to be addressed in order for us to do that. Or you can want to do this, but actually this policy is very similar, has a much greater impact to what we're talking about, right? So it's kind of like puzzle. We're in a big puzzle. And we're trying to put together this puzzle and all its nuance and complexity in order to really realize this. I think we're going to be successful. Right now, folks are dreaming of $1 billion to address anti-displacement. I think that's extremely practical in this context made up of from local governments, county government, state and federal dollars, as well as philanthropy. And I think we're looking at a range of policies that are addressing housing, residential, business, and cultural displacement. So we're kind of looking across those different considerations and making sure we get there. So we're not the important people in the room, other than that we're just making space for knowledge and for transparency and accountability, and to put this piece of puzzle together more than anything.
Thank you, C. Terrence. I really appreciate your response and honesty in that, and the perspective that you're bringing. And so with that, I think we can move into the audience Q&A. We already did discuss an audience question, so we can go ahead and look at some more. So one question is, how do we make the approaches that you all have described, the default and not the exception?
I'll jump in on that one. I think it takes time, and it's going to take a generational transition to happen. We better educate folks. we integrate community engagement and community participation and things like that that are relevant to equitable development into the curriculum, into the projects that, college students that are coming out in these fields are studying and taking. And when that becomes the default, we'll have a generation of folks that this is their default setting. And I think we're starting to see that. I've been very pleasantly surprised at the city of St. Paul and the city of Minneapolis, the folks that are starting to be in positions to, in terms of planning and in terms of development, are younger. They look more like me than not like me in a lot of cases, and they have a tendency to be very much more open to the ideas and the best practices that we come to them with than when I first started. And I would be shot down quite a bit and just not taken seriously, because it's like, oh, those things aren't possible. You couldn't possibly do that. And, there was a lack of ability to imagine the world that we were trying to create 25 years ago. And so I'm seeing a shift. I'm feeling a shift. I get a lot more support for the positions that I take now. I don't feel like I'm out on an island all the time. I feel like there's a lot of people that say, oh, this is actually sensible. This is logical. Let's do this. And so that, I think, gives me hope. But I think it has to be a full generational transition where there's a generation of folks that are educated and trained up in a certain manner. And when they start becoming on all sides of the table, from the community side to the municipality side to the architect and developer side, that's when we'll really be able to run fast.
So can you just repeat the question one time? Sorry.
Yeah, the question is, how do we make the approaches that you have all described the default and not the exception? And I also just want to say, James, thank you. I really appreciate your answer as a young person, in this field or a proximity to this field. Oftentimes, I think young people are shot down a lot. Just immediately, oh, well, you're just so young, you don't know what you're talking about. But I really appreciate your emphasis on that cross-generational, multi-generational collaboration across different sectors and identities. So thank you, James. Terrence, did you want to respond to this question as well?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a good question, a challenging question, because some of it is going to be unique to the actual experience in government that you're within, right? Because a lot of this is tethered in politics. A lot of this is tethered in right resources and all those different sort of things. But I believe the core things, one, don't boil the whole ocean at the same time, right? There's a lot that we're talking about here. And a lot of institutions make the mistake of trying to do everything at the same time. And it's just not going to happen. Like, give everybody an equity job, we need to sort of refine who we mean by experts and who are sort of going to carry this work, and giving them capacity and as well as ownership over this work, I think is really important. And hopefully you have those folks within your governments, and again, thinking about their own structure to be able to deliver things. But I think the biggest thing for me to change is restructuring the way that we do engagement, right? Restructuring the way in which communities have a voice over the structures, over the policies, over the different projects and programs and investments that will affect them. Like, I strongly believe that community has the answers for a lot of the things, right? Communities are the most powerful force for justice in your community. And I think in particular, I'm talking about marginalized communities. I'm not talking about like, hey, let's give everybody the same voice everywhere, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the folks who've been structurally disenfranchised from the process, being made a political power within the force of the work and the context that you're working doing. And I think we can spend a lot more time theorizing the way that that work does, but I think there's some very practical things that we can do there. The third thing I would say is just getting on the same page about what we're even talking about. I think because of my sickness, I forgot to mention this. One of the biggest misconceptions about equitable development is conflating that with following civil rights law, right? So following, right, you know, the myriad of civil rights law, depending on which aspect of development that you're talking about, but I'm sure folks know what I mean. But I just use this as an example. If we were to fully realize the Americans with Disabilities Act today, right, which we're not, right, we're 30 years in and probably at least 30 years away of fully realizing. Let's just imagine we snapped our fingers and tomorrow ADA was fully realized within all the buildings, within like everything that we did in society. If we did that and we snapped our fingers and that was law was fully realized, there would still be a gap between that and what people with disabilities fully need to be full participants and fully dignified in American society, right? And it's that gap that's what I mean by equity, right? And so I'm encouraged by James, who went beyond what is the normal call of what is being asked of him, or for Karla, who goes above and beyond what civil rights law or what the quote unquote policies talk about, right? Like going above and beyond the minimums, right? Are we just aiming too low, right? Those aspects of the conversation that showed up today, right? It's really getting clear that that's what we need to focus most of our time on, right? The law is the law. Like you need to do ADA, right? There shouldn't even really be a conversation about that. The conversation is how do we go above and beyond ADA to fully realize people with disabilities? How do we go above and beyond civil rights law for Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people with low incomes? Like, how do we just consider different elements within these projects that's really about humanization and consent? And I'm just gonna keep peppering those words in here because I think they're just such important words. That's what I would focus on, right? And big things to do, but I think these are very, very achievable things if you sort of aren't trying to boil the whole ocean and are kind of very clear about what we're talking about in the first place.
Thank you, C. Terrence. Oh, never mind. I thought Karla was coming off mute. All right. So another question we've got is, so we have time for one more question. So our last question is, in community organizations, government, institutions, etc., can we move our whole communities to shift wealth and power towards community-driven development? I'm seeing C. Terrence nod.
I'm trying not to talk about it. I wanted to give Karla a chance to chat just because she didn't go to the last question, but yeah.
Sure. I mean, I find that, I think I said this a couple of days ago, you know, we are in a capitalist society, but I was talking about sustainability, something that James talked about, and how do we change the narrative of why sustainable development is important, or sustainable buildings. And when we're talking to developers who are looking at a bottom line, you know, wanting to make the most off of a project, you know, how are we packaging why that's important, really speaking to their language? Because I'm just more of a practitioner that, you know, most developers are going to be developers, and they're going to want to know about the bottom line. But there are financial benefits, as James pointed out in his, as he walked us through his first development, which I thought was incredible, by the way, and how you package that and sell that back to a developer. So I think some of it has to do with how we're communicating and the messaging around it, to get people to be passionate about things like sustainability. And yeah, I just wanted to share that part, but I'll kick it back to C. Terrence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the simplest way I could say it, like, I think we spend a lot of government resources building more momentum for things that the market's already going to produce. And I think maybe government should focus more on the things that the market won't produce, but have a high value in our society. And that could be cultural value, it could be a lot of different things, right? Art value, like folks that produce art, right? The market isn't that interested in producing like beautiful architecture buildings. As much as we have like great architects around us, like they just build like these form function buildings all the time. But I think there's a lot of things that we can really talk about in there. Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe like the wealth as it's traditionally defined isn't the most important thing. I think there's another comment in the chat room about cities focusing on their tax bases more than anything, which is why I'm a big fan of regional planning, first of all, because we should address things as a region, not just as individual cities, as a zero-sum game, which I think is ultimately, and it has been researched to be, a losing game at the detriment of folks who are most vulnerable. And so I think we can really just restructure the way in which we plan, first of all, development across our region, and focus our resources in places where the market's not going to produce things, but still have high and tremendous value in our communities.
Can you repeat that question one more time so I can, it was kind of a big question.
For sure. So in community organizations, governments, institutions, etc., can we move our whole communities to shift wealth and power towards community-driven development?
I think my initial reaction to that is yes. Yes, we can, and yes, we should. I think that is probably the simplest way to achieve more positive results in our built environment. There is a model, a capitalist model, and there are ways in which we can tap into that if the playing field in terms of resources is leveled. So for me, the issue isn't as much capitalism or some other system. The system is just the vehicle. What we need are people that are competent, that are culturally competent, that are caring, and that are talented and to drive the vehicle, whatever the vehicle is. And so for me, yes, I think a shift in resource deployment with the talent and the brain power that we have available to us in all communities, yeah, I think we could achieve significantly better results in a very rapid period of time. I think, again, there's a vehicle. I think there are people that want to get in the vehicle and drive the vehicle who are very talented. And I feel like the inequitable resource distribution that we have sort of inherited over the last, in our case, almost 500 years in this hemisphere, limits the ability of folks to be able to get in and actually drive. So better drivers and more resources will allow us to take whichever vehicle towards a much better, qualitatively superior future.
Thank you, James. And so with that, we're at the end of our panel. Before I kick it over to the MCs, I just want to say, James, Karla, and Terrence, thank you all for being here today. And thank you not only for the work that you do, but for planting seeds in your respective fields and building capacity, challenging harmful norms, and shifting narratives in power. You are truly an inspiration, and we're so lucky to have you on this panel today. Thank you so much.